History is written by the victors, so the losers are not mentioned in it. Arthur Drexler. The War of 1812, also known as the First Patriotic War. Over more than 200 years, this war has inspired hundreds of books and paintings. Dozens of maps have been compiled, thousands of articles have been published, and dozens of films and essays have been released. It would seem that there is nothing new to learn about this war now. However, there are several facts that made me review archival materials. By the start of the war, St. Petersburg had already been Russia's capital for 100 years, and it housed the emperor, the state council, the senate, the treasury, the general staff, and other executive bodies in the form of various ministries. Despite the fact that the country's leadership was in St. Petersburg, for some reason Napoleon went to Moscow. So, who was Napoleon really fighting against? With Russia or with some other country? The story War and Peace is considered the best literary depiction of the War of 1812, although the work was written 57 years after this war. The author of this work, Count Leo Tolstoy, was born 16 years after the significant date. The most interesting thing is that many paintings were created based on this story. I will provide several examples from the book Events of 1812 and artistic images and paintings based on the novel War and Peace. Artists who read the novel envisioned a certain image, which they depicted in their works. Subsequently, this image gave the impression of the documentary nature of the depicted events. But was everything really like that? Also, there are a number of historical documents and maps that were released much later than the date of the war. I'll give a few examples. The map of the theater of war of 1812 was compiled by Lieutenant Colonel Poltoratsky of the General Staff. 1859. St. Petersburg. Poltoratsky's first and patronymic omitted. 1812 General Poltoratsky. Konstantin Poltoratsky, Imperial Russian Infantry Lieutenant General, fought 5 wars, INCL 1812. He died at the age of 75 in 1858, and the map was drawn by a person with the same last name in 1859. At the same time, the map looks as if it was used during military operations. In the video description, you can find a link to this map, and you can view the map in detail yourself. The problem is that the map was issued a year after the death of the only person, a participant in the war with that surname, who could have made the map. How convenient. The person died, but the map is signed with his surname. And here's another document. It's called Description of the Patriotic War of 1812. Written by Lieutenant General Mikhailovsky Danilevsky with 96 maps and plans. Published in St. Petersburg in 1840. Of course, now it's a significant historical artifact. But why was it released 28 years after the war? Another map of the War of 1812, which was released on the centenary in 1912, and the map was also compiled by a military officer. The map was compiled by Colonel Tomlin of the General Staff. Plan of the battles at the village of Borodino. Published in Moscow in 1824. 12 years is an excellent period to depict the battle on a map in detail. And another document is called the Patriotic War of 1812-1314. Like previous examples, the map document was compiled not soon after, but in 1911, nearly a century later. Oddly, it was written not by a historian, but by Lieutenant Colonel Teplikov. The list of such documents can go on. I have provided the most striking examples. Historians accused Kutuzov of letting Napoleon flee Russia. There was even a phrase to build a golden bridge, from a phrase used by Count Kutuzov himself. If you have ever examined the uniforms of the Russian and French armies during the War of 1812, you have surely noticed that there is a certain similarity. Similar uniforms, similar plumes, the tassels on the headgear. Sure, there were differences in crests, epaulet, and embroidery, but in battle, nobody studies such signs. Blue, French; green, Russians. Remember these colors. We'll need them a little later. But was the color of the uniform a rule by which soldiers distinguished comrades from the enemy? In the book titled Historical Description of the Clothing and Armament of Russian Troops, on page 30, we see the following remark. For daily use, the following uniform is assigned to the orderlies. A coat or uniform made of cloth, single-breasted. In the Life Guards Horse Regiment, dark blue. In the Dragoon and Jaeger regiments, light green. In all other troops, dark green. This provision was in effect until 1819. Moreover, you can find many paintings depicting Napoleon in a green uniform. Blue Russian batman. Enemy-clad Napoleon. Awe. And now I suggest looking at this painting. Here is depicted a Hussar attack, but it is not Russian Hussars, French Hussars. Russian bold Hussars, Lieutenant Orzhevsky, a myth from art, books, films. In reality, ordinary people could hardly tell Russian from French Hussars from afar. The truth is that both French and Russian Hussars had uniform colors of blue, dark blue, green, red, gray, and so on. What would happen if two regiments with the same color scheme met in battle? Why did Russian Hussar regiments look like part of the great Napoleonic army? Let's pause a bit on what was happening before the war. In 1807, Emperor Napoleon and Emperor Alexander I concluded the Treaty of Tilsit. Napoleon Alexander I letters. In Russian libraries, 1811. The last letter Napoleon wrote to Alexander I was from Moscow on September 12, 1812, after Moscow was occupied by the French. After the war, dozens of books dubbed Napoleon nothing less than the Antichrist himself. Were Alexander I and Napoleon really so close that they kept corresponding during the war, even though history tells us nothing about it? Also, this document mentions the proclamations by Napoleon and Alexander to their troops, issued when the Allied forces entered France. The date is not specified, but as far as we know, the Allied forces entered France only in 1814. Reading this paragraph, it gives the impression that Napoleon and Alexander were fighting on the same side and their troops were called Allied. Initially, the idea may seem wild, but let's see what evidence actually exists that this took place. In the manuscript collection, there is a mention of a speech to Napoleon from the deputies of the Mogilev province, delivered in Smolensk in French by a certain cavalier proser in 1812. Smolensk battle. Later paintings. Smolensk didn't resist Napoleon. It welcomed him with a speech. Back to Poltoratsky's war map. Despite the fact that the map was created much later, there is one interesting feature in the map. According to the map legend, troops are split into Russians and French only after Moscow was taken. Before that, they appear in one color. On the map, we indeed see such troops there. Fought together till Moscow fell. Tamlin's map. Detail. There is a seal of the general and the main staff, and the date is 1811. According to history, Napoleon attacked Russia in 1812, and the attack was sudden. So why do we see an 1811 map of the St. Petersburg General Staff, and moreover a map precisely of the area through which Napoleon was supposed to pass? This can only be explained in one way. In 1811, Alexander I, in his correspondence with Napoleon, agreed on an attack, and maps of this place were issued in St. Petersburg. 100 years later, this map was taken and the movements of troops were drawn according to a newly invented version. In 1813, an album with portraits of generals and officers from the 1812 war appeared in St. Petersburg. Notably, Russian inscriptions are duplicated in French. The cover letter is in French too. You'd expect, after the war with Napoleon, a surge of patriotism instead back then at home. But none of this happened. The French language was not just a fascia, and many residents of St. Petersburg really did not understand Russian well. Brskoitsevola. This is the name of a series of paintings depicting Russian men who cut off their own hands to avoid serving in the French army. There is an inscription about this at the bottom of the painting. But history doesn't tell us anything about Napoleon recruiting among the local common men during his invasion. Let's assume there was recruiting and many agreed to serve with the French. But how would they understand commands in French? Learning French was an elite privilege. The painting also shows an officer in a Russian green uniform. It also features a hussar wearing blue trousers with distinctive stripes on both legs. Russian hussars wore it too. Russians and French allied. Makes sense. Recruitment was conducted among the common population, and the new soldiers joined Russian-speaking units. The coats of arms of the troops of Napoleon I and Alexander I are very similar in style. This is a commemorative cup in honor of the centenary of the war. But why was the Antichrist Napoleon placed here? Or was it Napoleon? Did he win this war? Could this cup be some kind of unfortunate misunderstanding? On the 1812 Patriotic War Centennial, Moscow opened an exhibition titled In Memory of the Patriotic War of 1812. In the book titled A Brief Overview of the Exhibition, there is some description of the exhibits presented in it. At the exhibition, there were photographs of giant portraits of Emperor Alexander and Napoleon, made from live ornamental plants in the garden of the president of the Russian Society of Gardening Enthusiasts, Brokart & Co., Moscow. In memory of Napoleon perfume, cologne, soap. Other perfume bottle stoppers show busts of Emperor Alexander, Napoleon, and the French eagle. Boxes bear embossed images of Alexander and Napoleon. Napoleon bouquet, perfume, cologne, soap. French eagle caps. Baudelot. Cheap soap, illustrated wrap. The prize consists of a portrait of Napoleon and a brief description of the war. Also released were wines and champagne, Napoleon, Jubilee, and Napoleonic. The liqueurs were delivered by D.I. Travnikov. 2 embroideries, Napoleon on Elba. Likachevan delivered. Also, there were 2 lamps here. One kerosene with a papier match stand depicting Napoleon and Marshal Berthier. The other was electric, with a figure of a seated Napoleon made of plaster. Delivered to the museum by mission. Whoa, I think there are enough examples here to be convinced that Napoleon was made out to be the Antichrist primarily for the common people. And the image of Napoleon was placed next to the image of Alexander I in a rather respectful manner. Here, one can draw the closest analogy. Can you imagine an exhibition dedicated to the anniversary of the Great Patriotic War, where an image of Stalin is displayed alongside an image of Hitler? Honestly, I can't even imagine such a thing. Now, a perfectly reasonable question arises.
If the Russians and the French fought on the same side, then against whom were they fighting? In this painting by Giovanni Scotti, who was a contemporary of the War of 1812, we see an image of such warriors. Notice the warriors' clothing. It is a robe and a cap. They all have beards. But in the images of sappers, grenadiers, and hussars, you will not see beards. They were only allowed to have sideburns or mustaches. Note the commander depicted in the center of the painting. The uniform also differs from those shown earlier. In his hand, he holds a baton, a symbol of princely power. In this painting, titled The Flight of the French from Moscow, we also see the depiction of an unusual warrior. Yakovlev's lithograph. Count Orlov Denisov. Unknown troops behind. All the warriors are somehow holding spears, and all have beards. And here's another painting. It's called The Attack of the Russians on the Barricaded Camp near Dreusa. Notice, there is a battle against people in clothing of different colors. The people are armed with sabers and spears, while soldiers in blue uniforms are shooting at them with firearms. Another interesting painting, titled Prussian Uhlans and Cossacks in Battle Against the French Guard. Here in the center of the painting, on the left, we see the image of a French cuirassier, who is shooting at two people with a pistol. Below it is labeled that they are a Bashkir and a Cossack. Notice, the Cossack is holding a spear in his hand, while the Bashkir is shooting a bow. Could they really have used a bow in the early 19th century? What do we actually know about this war? And another painting, which also relates to the War of 1812. The painting is called The Death of a Wounded Cowman. Notice, we also see a bow in the warrior's hand. Another comic-style painting depicting the events of the War of 1812. Notice how the Russians are depicted here. They are depicted on the right side. Why? Wars are depicted in the presented paintings. Who do they resemble? I propose we return to the previously presented Old Believer manuscript, which is called The Tale of Napoleon the Antichrist. RSL manuscript. Prophetic. Written. The prophecy tells of the coming of the Antichrist Napoleon, who will himself seize the Roman capital, gather all the countless hordes, overthrow the southern capital, and ascend the throne. And no forces can overcome him. Only Moses' army will catch him. Cossacks, and a bearded host with crosses. Hordes of great Streltsy, loyal sons of the homeland, mustered by southern Tsar. Cast out, empire falls. They're 1617 Streltsy. But were the Streltsy really dressed like this at the beginning of the 19th century? One of the key themes of the War of 1812 is the story of Moscow. Napoleon advanced on Moscow, but per official version, the Feely War Council chose to abandon it without fight. French troops entered, then the city was set ablaze. To reinforce this image, dozens of paintings on this theme were created by famous artists. But was everything really like that? The painting is called The Triumphal Entry of Napoleon into Moscow. Napoleon, green coats, Russians, crowd watches, commoners, nobles. It's strange, because history tells us that most people left Moscow, and the French entered an already empty city. And here's another painting, which depicts burning Moscow. There would be nothing surprising in this painting if it weren't for the inscription above stating that Moscow is the capital of Russia. Although, according to official history, the capital at that time was the city of St. Petersburg.
Another painting is called The Battle for Moscow, or The Battle of Moscow. In the background, we see the city, and also we see the fortress with the city's defenders on it. Painting, Moscow not abandoned, conquered. I suggest looking at a picture that depicts the events in Moscow in 1812. The caption at the top reads, "The Departure and the Fire of Moscow." In the first illustration, we see a battle. It says that the French fought the Russians. A little lower, an attack on Moscow is depicted. It says that the Russians defended Moscow. Next, the illustration indicates that all the wounded were healed. On the right is an illustration showing that the French captured Russians, and the lower illustration indicates that the French left Moscow in flames and abandoned the city. In Avenarius's book, titled Among Enemies, Diary of a Young Eyewitness of the War of 1812, which was for some reason published in 1912, there is an image of a medal for the capture of Moscow by the French. On top it says that this medal honors the Grand Army's entry into Moscow. I found an original image of this medal in the French National Library. Unfortunately, only one side is shown. At top, the inscription says entry into Moscow. If Moscow had been abandoned and the French entered an empty city, then why was a medal made for the entry into Moscow? An interesting detail on this medal is the domes, or more precisely, what's above them. Everyone agrees. They really look nothing like Christian crosses. So what religion was in Moscow before this year? In the book titled Numismatic Monuments of the Patriotic War, there is an image of a medal called French Eagle on the banks of the Volga. It says this medal shows the campaign planned in March to the Volga, which never happened due to circumstances beyond Napoleon's control. Thus, it was, so to speak, a minted advance account of events that were to occur. On the reverse side, an allegory of the river god Volga, fleeing right in terror, envisioning a pole with the French standard set on the riverbank. Let's assume that historians are right and Napoleon minted this medal in advance. Now I suggest we look at another medal called the Retreat of the Grand Army. With this medal, the last in the French series on the events of 1712, there actually begins a series of medals pointing to events connected with the fall of Napoleon. On the reverse, an allegory shows the French army as a warrior in ancient dress, running right. Iolus unleashes Boreas on a warrior. Abandoned cart, cannon, fallen horse, leafless tree, desolation. Thus, judging by the content of the medal, the French retreated only due to the elements, which is some consolation for their national sentiment. If a medal with the French eagle on the banks of the Volga can somehow be explained, then this medal cannot be explained at all. Firstly, the medal states that it was November 1812. Who could foresee November freeze? Retreating, Napoleon lost most troops. Eastern campaign ended in disgrace, according to the official version. So is that really a reason to mint a new medal? Therefore, I assume that Napoleon did reach the Volga, conquering not only the Muscovite kingdom, but also the Kazan kingdom, approaching closely to the Kalmyks and Nogay. Thus it is possible to explain where the latter appeared in the paintings of the battles of the War of 1812. After that, in November, frosts unusual for that time struck, and the Grand Army had to retreat, especially since they had already completed the main task. 3. Apparently, there was some basis for this. In 1813-14, John Thomas James, a student of Christ Church, Oxford, visited a number of countries: Germany, Sweden, Russia, and Poland. Based on the results of the trip,
He wrote a book and drew interesting illustrations of Russia. He also spoke with people and gathered information about the current situation in Russia, what happened during the war, and what happened before the war. I will now read excerpts from his book. But this is a digression that can be made regarding what we have heard, rather than what we actually saw during our stop. This will better bring us back to our previous topic and attempt a brief description of the city of Moscow. The main idea is simple. Few cities have squares with a simpler layout. The ancient Kremlin and Kitay Gorod sit in the central part of the elevation above the Moskva River. Around these, like rings, Belai Gorod, Zemlyanoi Gorod, and Sloboda stand out, marked here and there by successive growth lines. Kitay Gorod, also called the Tartar City, apart from a few religious buildings, was chiefly a place of trade within its walls, a public exchange lined with houses of commerce, market rooms, counting shops, booths, shops amid ruins, street butts, Kremlin, public offices, state apartments. And we made a one-day stop here as our start, to see the lone remnant of the capital's ancient splendor, seat of princes and tsars. It stood amid intact surroundings from the time of fire. But Napoleon's savage rage struck what Russian piety would have spared. With unimaginable spite, he singled out for ruin the proud fortress's finest parts. One of the peremptory orders that was given was to blow up the Kremlin he occupied after his departure. The mines were ready, and at 2 a.m., on their last night, this awful plan was then executed. From the first 2 explosions, part of the wall and one of the towers near the river were destroyed. The third blast blew up St. Nicholas Church and 4 famed Moscow bells with incredible force. At this time, the lofty tower of Ivan the Great, the first Tsar, was torn from top to base and, cutting through the domes that crowned its summit, collapsed into ruins below. The fourth shock was far from the worst. The arsenal walls, over 3 yards thick, with part of St. Nicholas Gate and several adjoining turrets, were blasted into the air in one area. Shock sufficient to level the entire city to its foundations. In the same book, on page 39, the following description is given, which possibly points to an economic cause of the war. During the summer of 1812, agents of the Jewish house in Rothenburg were collecting gold coins and ingots, buying them at any price in every district, and sending it all to Russia. Bonaparte to Moscow. Panic, gold hoarding. It was said that transactions were being carried out with a 20% profit. Earlier, I already mentioned that Napoleon, while in Moscow, wrote a letter to Alexander I. I think now is the perfect time to read this letter. Russia, State College of Foreign Affairs, Chancellery. Letter from Napoleon I to Alexander I about the fire in Moscow on September 20th, 1812. Handwritten in French. Sire, Moscow burned, Rostopchin. No malice in war. One note from you, either before or after the last battle, would have stopped my advance. And I would indeed have been willing to yield to you the advantage of entering Moscow first. If your Majesty still retains any part of those former feelings, you will graciously accept this letter. Nevertheless, you can only be grateful to me for apprising you of what is happening in Moscow. Therefore, gracious sir, my brother, I pray to God to protect your Majesty and keep you under his holy and worthy protection. Well, now the 2 commanders really had a reason to quarrel. Napoleon explicitly says that he would have given Alexander I the right to enter Moscow. I present to you a French map of the theater of operations of the war. 1812 War, France-Russia. Original map, BNF. Here, map shows European part. Russia splits. Muscovy and Muscovite Tartary,
per two inscriptions. Regions. Governorates/administrations. Arkhangelsk, Novgorod, Smolensk, Belgorod, Kiev, and Voronezh governorates. The remaining regions are marked as duchies or kingdoms. For example, in the central part, we see the Moscow, Rostov, Shuzhda, and Vladimir kingdoms. The Kazan kingdom is marked in a separate color. Also shown here are kingdoms that, per the official account, vanished in the 16th century. The Siberia, Bulgar, and Astrakhan kingdoms listed here. Judging by the map, these territories stand apart and are not part of Russia at all. It's hard to believe that this map is from the early 19th century. Thus, Russia on this map does not appear as a unified entity. The map contradicts the official history and strongly supports the Russian version instead. Muscovy fought with Muscovite Tartary. In the book Description of the War of 1813, which I have already mentioned, the following quote from Alexander I is given. The War of 1812 is the last war for the independence of states. We must either perish or prevail. The statement is actually quite strange. In 1812, Napoleon attacked Russia, threatening to capture the entire country. So what independence is being discussed, and why is there talk of states instead of a single country? Another page of the War of 1812, which is not often mentioned in official history, is the People's Militia. In famous artist depictions of the 1812 war, oddly, the People's Militia is almost never pictured in those scenes. Nevertheless, the People's Militia was assembled in various regions, and in the Moscow militia alone there were 32,000 people. This painting shows a Moscow militiaman giving his life to kill Napoleon, but mistakenly kills a Polish colonel instead. Notice, again we see a spear, something like a uniform, and we see that the warrior has a beard. In 1812, the war was not only on the European continent. In the same year, the war was also on the North American continent, and this war continued until 1815. American researchers are puzzled as to why the war in America has not been given due attention in world history. I will provide some book titles dedicated to this war. The War of 1812, The Forgotten Conflict. War of 1812, Conflict for the Continent. 1812 War with America. Interestingly, according to the official version, France was at war with England, and we can see uniforms that are similar, differing only in the color of the uniform. Native Americans also participated in this war. If we consider the image of the ruler of Florida from the early 18th century, which I mentioned earlier, and who looked quite European, it can be concluded that the events may not have occurred as stated in the official version, and the Europeans who conquered North America chose to hide the war's true situation from everyone. However, it can be unequivocally concluded that the War of 1812 was essentially a world war. The War of 1812 is simply filled with Masonic symbolism. The eye in the floating pyramid is a symbol of the all-seeing eye. This symbol can be seen not only on medals, but also in architecture. The phrase that appears on medals, "Not unto us, not unto us, but to thy name," hints at the initiators of this war. In this painting from the 1812 exhibition, we see an allegorical depiction of Napoleon. At the top, the same floating and glowing pyramid with an eye in the middle. Just below is an emblem very similar to the symbol of Alexander I. A crown is mounted atop this emblem. Russia's imperial double-headed eagle. On Napoleon's shoulders, Roman warrior. Note that Napoleon is depicted quite honorably, despite being at the bottom of the hierarchy. One might wonder, what does Napoleon have to do with Rome? Quite directly. In another painting, Napoleon is labeled as the king of the Romans. The Holy Roman Empire existed until the early 19th century, and after it became clear that the Eastern Empire no longer posed a significant threat, the Roman Empire was dissolved. In the 19th century, the hero of humorous plays and comics was Tartarin. Everywhere he was depicted as foolish and undeservedly receiving awards and honors. Also, he was depicted as a soldier of the War of 1812. Thus, the war that began in 1812 was essentially a war of two worlds. The Western world, represented by the Roman Empire,
and the Eastern world, Novochesky and